Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining for the conversation. My name is Jose Echeverría. I am a non-resident fellow of the Atlantic Council Adrian Ayres Latin America Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this space. On January 15th, President Arévalo will complete his first year in office in Guatemala. Today, experts will analyze what is on the horizon for Guatemala. For this, I would like to welcome and thank you our three distinguished speakers joining us today. Jointly, briefly, is going to join us as well, Lisardo Bolaños, former Undersecretary of Investment and Competition, and Technical Coordinator from Guatemala No Se Detiene. Also, in this space is with us, María Fernanda Bozmoski, who is Director of Impact and Operation and Lead for Central America for the Adrian Ayres Latin America Center from the Atlantic Council, and Christa Walters, who is the Executive President from Movimiento Cívico Nacional. As President Arévalo completes his first year in office, this conversation will reflect on the administration's main achievements, challenges, and the priorities that might define its agenda for the next 3 years. Panelists will assess the government's efforts in attracting investment, promoting trade, and strengthening governance while considering key opportunities and challenges that remain. Additionally, the discussion will explore how the government can position itself as a key partner to the incoming Trump administration and examine ways it can foster closer collaboration with the private sector, civil society, and other international partners, especially such as Taiwan, to ensure policies are impactful, inclusive, and sustainable. Before we delve into the conversation, remember that you can submit your questions using the hashtag ACCentralamerica. And we will begin this conversation asking all our panelists the same question. And we will start with Christa Walters. And the first question to start the conversation is, as President Arévalo complete his first year in office, what do you see as the administration's most significant accomplishments so far?
Morning to everyone, and thank you, Jose, and thank you to the Adrian Ayres Latin America Center for having me. I think when it comes to this administration's most significant accomplishments, I would have to point out foreign policy. Guatemala has had a historical tradition in, joining the U.S. and other Western powers in backing nations like Israel and Taiwan, which I think has been positive that Arévalo's administration has continued to do. But also, if we remember last year's transition period, it was a very difficult transition period. And so the country's image had been, severely damaged under those few last months of President Giammatei's administration, which did prompt Arévalo to undertake a tour to rebuild Guatemala's alliances and also calm certain tensions abroad. And although the president was criticized for being a very good foreign affairs minister, I think that in terms of foreign policy, Arévalo did succeed in repositioning Guatemala as a democratic country, as a democratic nation, and also expressing, his gratitude to the international community that supported his democratic transition. And I think we still have some results to see from those trips abroad and that tour that he took to, the U.S., Central America, and also Europe. But I think that numerically we could say that those alliances and that foreign policy has reflected, for example, an increase in tourism for Guatemala. There has been an increase of about 14% in foreign tourism to the country and several commitments and announcements for foreign investment that I hope would materialize in the next year. But also in terms of foreign policy, the president focused on a very specific issue that built citizens' trust maybe and also hope, in the sense that Arévalo focused, for example, in resolving Guatemala's situation in the international sports community. He went to Switzerland and addressed the suspension the Guatemalan Olympic Committee had that prevented Guatemalan athletes from carrying our national flag or even playing the national anthem when competing in international competitions. And he did get the suspension lifted. And so that paved the way for Guatemalan athletes to participate in the Olympics under our flag. And unfortunately, it did turn out well. We had our first bronze medal. No, I mean our first gold medal and a bronze medal for Guatemala. But that's in terms of foreign policy. Here in the country, I would have to say that although there was some speculation about the president's power, for example, in Congress, his party somehow demonstrated a little political skill while securing, for example, certain laws and also approving funds for this year's 2025 government plan. So I would have to say those are very specific accomplishments that I see that from this administration.
Thank you, Christa. And you have mentioned lots of international efforts, and also we could call it like wins or accomplishments. And talking about that, Maria Fernanda, you're based in Washington, D.C. with Atlantic Council. So which are the accomplishments that you see or you can identify from Arévalo administration during this first year?
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Christa and Lisardo as well for joining us for this, our first Twitter space of the year. I would agree with many of Christa's remarks with the work that Arévalo, the successful work that Arévalo has done to repair the image of Guatemala abroad, whether it's in the United States, his meeting with President Biden. He's done an excellent job traveling and making sure that the image of Guatemala is repaired abroad. I would also say that it's not a small feat that he's been able to complete year one of his mandate. A lot of the narrative that we saw during the election season was about all the attempts to undermine or to prevent him from running or to prevent him from taking office. I mean, all of us remember the very long inauguration last January. And that is, in that we see a story of how Guatemala's institutions are actually quite resilient, are perhaps even stronger than we've historically given credit to the institutions for. So I think that that's something that is worth mentioning. And I think from Washington, D.C., we see that Guatemala's economy continues to be extremely stable, resilient to internal and external factors. It's one of the more, I would say, resilient economies in Central America. And we've seen that growth has sustained, GDP growth has sustained over the past few years. The other thing that I would highlight that is important and that we've taken notice here in Washington, D.C., is the progress on the digital agenda, the anti-red tape law that aims to streamline bureaucratic processes. For example, the Ministry of Economy now has a fully electronic system for processes and procedures. That is extremely important in the country's attempts to increase transparency and to make sure that businesses and potential investors see that Guatemala is a country where you can come and invest and you know what to expect. That the rules of the game won't just change on you. So I would highlight those three things: the completion of his first year, his ability to repair the image of Guatemala abroad, and the progress on the digital agenda.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. And now that we're talking about what's next, or what should be the focus for the next 3 years, after talking about the accomplishments, Maria Fernanda, what are the key challenges that remain critical, and how do you think this might shape the administration agenda for the next 3 years?
Jose, I would say that there's still a lot of work to be done on the infrastructure side of things. Everything from roadways to ports, including the airport, to energy. That is going to be critical for sustained, in private sector investment, foreign direct investment, attraction of FDI. So I think that there's a recognition from the government that progress in the infrastructure space needs to accelerate. Specifically on energy, we saw a successful tender that in the third quarter of last year, of 2024, the bidding process, the PEG5, which will focus on renewable energy sources. That is something that is extremely attractive to investors. It's also in line with Guatemala's more ambitious goals of energy, like the energy transition and energy security. So I think that on the infrastructure side, there's a lot of work to be done. The other thing is, I was also talking about the steady economic growth that the country has experienced. I think that when you look at it, that economic growth has not necessarily translated into meaningful reductions in poverty or decreased inequality. So I think that Arévalo came into power with very high expectations, with a very strong mandate from the people, and now the people need to feel like he's delivering, like their lives are getting better. We saw an important reduction in inflation last year. So now things, when you go to the grocery store, you should be able to feel that in your pockets. So despite the growth that we've seen, the country continues to struggle with high poverty rates. And I think that situation is also further complicated by the large size of the informal economy. So those are kind of the things that I would highlight as challenges for the next 3 years.
Great. Thank you, Maria Fernanda. And Christa, do you see the same challenges as Maria Fernanda was mentioning, that you are based in Guatemala and as a president of local NGO, or you see other different challenges that remain critical for the next 3 years?
Thank you, Jose. I do agree with what Mafe was pointing out, but I would also like to remember or point also out that when Arévalo came into power, it sparked a lot of enthusiasm. There was an unusual enthusiasm, that optimism, change. Somehow, Guatemalans have been tired for so long, tired of corruption, stagnation, and promises that fall through. And I agree with what Mafe said, that there were high expectations when Arévalo came into office, and the pressure to meet those demands for transparency, for justice, and development have become a constant test for his administration. And for example, during this first year in office, there have been several rotations in his cabinet, in ministers and deputy ministers, in around 7 of the 14 ministries that we have here in Guatemala. And well, these changes have highlighted significant challenges, challenges that range from lack of capacity to manage and effectively lead institutions to other, for example, cases of corruption that maybe this administration has failed to prevent. And it might seem like a paradox that although transparency has been this administration or Arevalo's main narrative or discourse, it does remain one of the government's most prominent pillars to be taken into account, and the constant adjustments in his cabinet, I believe, have exposed certain flaws, structural flaws, that raise doubts about not only his leadership but also his team's ability to uh, clean the house, as we would say here, and ensure a very stable governance. And I also agree with the infrastructure crisis. I think that's one of the administration's key priorities. It has to be Arevalo's and for the next administration to pay attention to this because, for example, La Aurora Airport was received in terrible conditions with serious infrastructure problems, such as the lack of water, air conditioning, or non-functional escalators, or poorly maintained restrooms and equipment. And although the problems in this administration perceive or persist, I think that there's a lot to do with the airport, for example, and Arevalo did announce a public-private partnership as a fundamental solution, and I think that postponing this measure will do more harm than good to the country. In terms of infrastructure, again, the Palines-Cuintla highway hasn't been repaired, and it remains a pending challenge for this government to find a solution for a highway that is so important for for the for the transportation of goods and people and resources here in Guatemala, and um, and that's in terms of infrastructure. And another thing that I would say that needs to be part of this administration's agenda for the next 3 years is malnutrition. There has been an increase in malnutrition cases of acute malnutrition that have been alarming in recent years, and it has surpassed those that were observed during other governments, and that has been, I think, a major setback for Semilla, which had prioritized reducing child malnutrition in its government plan. And as far as 2024, there have been more than 80 children that have died due to this cause to malnutrition. So I think those 3 points could be very important for the next 3 years.
Thank you, Christa. And now going more broadly in the international sphere, with the victory of President Trump in the United States, I want to ask Maria Fernanda, with the incoming U.S. administration, what shifts in the U.S.-Guatemala relations do you anticipate, particularly on shared priorities, including migration, security, and investment, that can be a focus or points to put attention on?
Thank you, Jose. I think there's a lot of course, speculation and expectations of what a second Trump administration will mean, not only for Guatemala and Central America, but for the region in general. I think that there's, to a certain degree, even an excitement with the nominations that Trump has put forth at the highest levels of the State Department. Marco Rubio knows Latin America very well, and the Deputy Secretary of State, Chris Landau, was his ambassador to Mexico in the first term. So he knows Latin America pretty well as also. Also, a number of the ambassador nominations that Trump has made thus far are to Latin America and the Caribbean. So there's an incoming focus on Latin America. And I think that at the end of the day, the basis of kind of the pillars that shape the US Guatemala relationship will remain unchanged. As you've mentioned, I think that they'll continue to focus on investment and migration and security. I think that the United States needs to recognize in Guatemala, they need to see in Guatemala, perhaps, I mean, I would go to the extreme of saying the most important partner that they could have at this moment in the region. And the reason for that is that Guatemala is Taiwan's largest diplomatic ally in the world. That relationship is so important for the Trump administration to achieve their goals of containing China's influence in the region, that if that relationship, if Guatemala's relationship with Taiwan were to fall or break, that would be catastrophic for the Western Hemisphere. So, I think that on the surface, you could say that perhaps that President Trump and President Arévalo are very different ideologically, but I think that the two administrations will prioritize pragmatism. And I think that there is alignment in foreign policy goals, and I think that there needs to be that recognition from President Trump that Guatemala is very important to the United States, to the security of the Western Hemisphere. And I would go as far as saying also that President Trump should visit Guatemala. He should make that one of his first stops once he's in office starting next week.
Great, thank you, Maria Fernanda. And you were mentioning several points that may seem like an important or critical opportunity for Guatemala to position as a key partner for the Trump administration. In following up question, are those the opportunities that you identify? Do you identify other ones, and how could Guatemala be propositivo in this way, in how to tackle these opportunities?
Sorry, is that a follow-up question for me?
Yeah.
I lost you for a second.
Yeah, Maria Fernanda. I was asking how could Guatemala foreign policy achieve those opportunities, and if you see other opportunities as well that could position Guatemala as a key partner for the Trump administration.
I think that the work that the embassy in Guatemala is doing, the Guatemala embassy in the United States is doing to promote the importance of the bilateral ties, everything from commercial to security to also migration, I think is worth highlighting, and that that work needs to continue. I think that also there's a lot of, I think that the incoming U.S. Congress will also be important. Having relationships there. I think that there's been a lot of speculation in the news about President Arévalo being willing to work with Trump on this idea that there will be mass deportations. Or so it has been reported, that he would be willing to accept maybe some non-Guatemalan deportations. And I think that were that to be true, it's pretty smart, because you need a workforce that is prepared for the challenges of the 21st century, and many of the migrants that have spent number of years in the United States have a lot of skills that they could take back to Guatemala, and you have a productive workforce that could really help Guatemala's economy, could really help in the reactivation of Guatemala's economy. Um, I think that it's obvious that President Arévalo is more than willing to work with the Trump administration and whatever may be thrown their way. And I think that those visits to the United States need to continue. And I do think that there's an opportunity to continue to strengthen U.S. Guatemala ties again, keeping in mind what a key ally Guatemala is for the United States.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. Christa, would you like to add something regarding these opportunities for Guatemala to position as a key partner for the Trump administration?
Yes, I think that, for example, the high-level economic dialogue is a refreshing platform that should continue to work with Trump's administration and Arevalo's administration, because this high-level economic dialogue has moved away from other stiff strategies or plans that haven't had the best results in the past. Nevertheless, I think that the HLED's line of effort, that is investment promotion, has to be prioritized. Why? Because we need more job creations here in Guatemala. And what do we need from Guatemala in the U.S. relation for this? There's many things, but one of them has to be to continue to attract foreign investment. And by this, I don't mean only commitments, I mean real investment projects. And one way to do that is to showcase Guatemala's competitive advantages with a working group that unites both US and Guatemalan stakeholders. I think that is extremely important. In the context of this high level economic dialogue, I do believe that is possible. And on the other hand, I think that, well, the collaboration between the U.S., Guatemala, and the private sector here in our country, in terms of projects that join forces to address very pressing challenges, are important. For instance, there is this interinstitutional coalition that aims directly in addressing health issues in our country, to transform, for example, the quality of life of families that don't have housing, and projects like Hogares that has a USAID, Progreso, Banco Industrial, or CMI, and other organizations joining forces to replace dirt floors with concrete floors, can serve as an example of what kind of projects are sustainable and have key impact in Guatemalans' lives. For example, this project Hogares, the housing improvement actions and the interventions with water filters or energy saving stoves or other financial education training, can be incorporated. And so far, the pilot projects have been successful. And I think that these types of alliances are good, are meant to be continued. And it does showcase that there are different private sector stakeholders that are willing to do different projects here in Guatemala. And also, with the help of USAID, we could showcase how some projects do work and others don't work to change the lives of Guatemalans and help them find more opportunities here in the country instead of migrating to the US.
Thank you, Christa. And going on now into more local and based in Guatemala situation. In this past year, from Arevalo administration, what progress has been made towards strengthening institutions and rebuilding public trust in governance? And how can accountability mechanisms be further enhanced to continue improving this public trust? That's for Christa.
Okay, thank you, Jose. To be honest, I would like to say a lot on this, but I haven't seen much progress in strengthening certain institutions in 2024, and I do perceive few results in building citizens' trust, but there are certain things that we could point out that the Arevalo administration has done. Again, due to the high expectations that were generated last year, the government, yes, the government has been pro democracy, has been anti corruption, but that doesn't seem to translate into stronger public institutions. Um, what has existed, I do believe, is a consistency, like Mafe said, in some economic institutions, which has so far maintained our country's macroeconomic stability, which is great. But on the other hand, I would have to say, when it comes to public trust in governance, maybe the weekly press conferences are a sign of accountability to rebuild citizens' trust. From AMLO, from fortunately, but by introducing them, I think this administration is communicating better with the average Guatemalan and with the press. So that type of communication has improved. Also, the dashboard to follow up on corruption complaints that was implemented by the Anti-Corruption Commission with the Anti-Corruption SAR is a positive thing. But I was mentioning that I don't perceive significant improvements in citizens' trust because, for example, from MCN, from Movimiento Cívico Nacional, we have experienced firsthand how a very basic constitutional principle has been, well, overseen in 2024, and that is access to public information regarding the collective agreement between the Ministry of Education and the Teachers Union. That collective agreement that should be public to everyone, to every Guatemalan, has been kept confidential, despite that being illegal. So I would have to say that to have better accountability or a good mechanism to implement government's transparency and government's accountability to everything they do, a huge step that Guatemalans would take into account is that these collective agreements or the process of the collective agreements are done have to be transparent and public because we're talking about something that at the end of the day not only in this case affects public and education, but it also impacts state resources, and these resources at the end of the day come from Guatemalan taxpayers. So I would have to say that to improve citizens' trust, this could be a very quick and very positive action for Arevalo's government to be able to make that collective agreement public for everyone.
Thank you, Krista. And following up in that question, Krista, you have mentioned one, I think it's like a policy decision, but what are some of the most pressing governance reforms or policy decisions that this administration needs to move forward within the next 3 years? How can it overcome political fragmentation and resistance to successfully advance these priorities?
Yeah, I was saying that although the government has emphasized anti-corruption efforts, and Arevalo actually ran an anti-graft campaign, I think the current administration must also prioritize certain reforms that do ensure consistent enforcement and strengthening of the rule of law, not just for the sake of it or not just to, um, not just for the sake of it or for anti-corruption efforts, but also to build investors' confidence and promote economic growth. Therefore, I think reforms regarding legal certainty for investment are key, primarily focused on encouraging both foreign and domestic investment so we can generate more employment. And I think that this could be achieved by creating, for example, contracts between the state or private entities that stabilize or freeze certain tax, internal levy, or customs or royalty regulations. There is a law in Congress that needs to be reformed for this that can provide a more certain legal framework for investment. Also, reforms to the procurement law regarding public works supervision is important, aiming, well, to incorporate the state's procurement system to an instrument or a tool that allows for a better supervision and oversight of public works development. And this is extremely tied to infrastructure. And so the goal of reforming this procurement law is, first of all, to ensure the quality of our government spending, but also strengthening the role of oversight and physical execution of public works. And as I mentioned, this is key for infrastructure. And I also think that other reforms or other laws that facilitate, for example, public-private partnership are needed as well. I mentioned before the airport's public-private partnership that was announced last year, but let's remember that other projects that are PPPs have been stagnant for years, and hopefully that's not the case for the airport, because there isn't a framework that helps projects to advance faster. And so that's something that we need. We need strengthening the rule of law, but also strengthening a certainty for investment.
Thank you, Christa. And Maria Fernanda, Christa mentioned before the high-level economic dialogue, and you as a director in the Atlantic Council and in your work, I know you have been involved or keeping track about this high-level economic dialogue. What are your opinion on what do you think this high-level economic dialogue means for Arévalo administration, and also looking forward into the next administration as well, how this mechanism could play a pivotal role into attracting investment in Guatemala if it could achieve that?
Thank you, Jose. I think that in the last year, the H-led is definitely one of the biggest wins of for both countries. The United States, before having this high-level economic dialogue with Guatemala, only had them with Mexico and Colombia in the Western Hemisphere, and that speaks to the importance of Guatemala for the United States in a number of areas. In the first year, I think that both countries saw progress in the goals. The pillars of the H-led being good governance and investment promotion, energy security, food security. That those are the work hasn't stopped. The work must continue, and I think that perhaps we'll see what happens, but perhaps the Trump administration will want to give it a different name. It's very much a Biden-Harris initiative, the Central America Forward, all of this. So, I would expect to see a continuation of these kind of dialogues in the next years, but perhaps under a different name. It will be rebranded, but I think that the substance and the goals will remain mostly the same. One of the, as the Atlantic Council, we were in Guatemala in February of 2024, and we had first we hosted a private dinner with the president, the VP, the Minister of Economy, and the private sector, where we talked about what would success look like for the HLIT a year from now. And there were some big ideas, but there were also some more concrete, smaller wins. And then the next day we had a public conference where we again talked about this. And one thing that came up was, Guatemala has been working for 30 years, more or less, to open up the US market to our avocados. And, that finally happened in 2024. That happened because of the relentless work of the United States and Guatemala, the relevant stakeholders, and there's a lot of excitement with Guatemalan avocados now having the U.S. as a market. So I think that I'm mentioning that because it's an example of what happens when you're committed to the same goals, when you have the same vision. And there are so many other areas like that where, if the United States and Guatemala continue to work together, that we'll continue seeing these kind of wins. That this is huge. This is huge for the Guatemalan avocado producer, and it's going to help, create jobs. It's going to help bring prosperity. It's going to help reduce migration. All of these things are connected. So I think, to summarize that, I think that the basis and the foundation of the high-level economic dialogue will continue. Maybe it'll be rebranded, but there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of momentum. So I think it would be, the United States would be shooting itself in the foot if it were to completely, stop this in its tracks.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. And now let's go with Christa. I'm talking about looking into the next 3 years of Arévalo administration. How can Guatemalan government work with the private sector and civil society to ensure policies and decisions driven by the executive branch are successful and sustainable in the long term?
Thank you, Jose. You know that I love bringing policy theory to life. And when it comes to, for example, political systems theory, political scientists like to analyze 4 key aspects. First, institutions. Second, actors. Third, policies. And fourth, feedback. So when you ask about how government can work with civil society, we have to focus on the 4th pillar, feedback, meaning that I do believe that this government has a great opportunity to innovate in ways for citizens to assess the effectiveness of policies or the performance of institutions or public actors. Because this can, for one, lead to policy adjustments, but also reforms or even changes in leadership. And why do I say that this government has an opportunity to innovate is that other governments in the past haven't had any instrument, any tool for citizens to assess or react to policies that have been implemented. And when I mentioned before the strengthening of communication between government and the average Guatemalan, I think that this government has the opportunity to innovate and be actually a trailblazer when it comes to assessing or reacting to policies and feedback from civil society. I'm not sure what the tool might be at this moment, but I think that there is a great opportunity there. And for the private sector, I'm convinced that public-private partnerships for infrastructure projects can spur economic growth and, most importantly, job creations. I was mentioning that we've had a law on public-private partnerships since 2010. That means we've had a regulatory framework that since around 2011 could have been used and leveraged to structure projects through ANADIE, which is the National Agency for Development of Economic Infrastructure. However, it wasn't until 2021 that, for example, the Escuintla Puerto Quetzal Highway project was approved. And it wasn't until last year that the study that establishes some technical engineering conditions or developments was approved. So if we do the math, we've had a legal framework that could have been used for over 10 years. And then we've had to wait another 3 years for a study to be approved or implemented for this highway project to come to life. And so I think that something that can be worked jointly between the private sector and government is to streamline the way public-private partnerships are formed and also executed, whether that involves reforms or regulatory changes to ANADIE. I think that this is something that can be prioritized, and I think that the private sector is willing to do for projects. For example, like the one that I mentioned with the airport, to really come to life, and so we don't have to wait 13 or 15 years for these PPPs to be a success. And I think that the private sector is willing to work on those reforms or willing to work on changes that make it possible for our infrastructure to grow and to grow in a timely manner, not wait as long as we had, for example, with the Escuintla or Puerto Quetzal
Thank you,
highway.
Christa. Great insights about how to elaborate and how to continue those partnerships between different sectors in Guatemala. And Maria Fernanda, between international sectors, how can Guatemala leverage its relationship with international partners to continue fostering economic growth and social development? For instance, what proactive strategies can it adopt to ensure a productive collaboration with the incoming U.S. administration? What do you think about this?
I think Guatemala has done a great job of, as we've been talking about, of let's say repairing its image abroad, and I think that we've seen in the president a conciliatory tone, not only inside the country but also externally, and I think that that's how the international community mostly sees President Arévalo, as a very skilled diplomat, one who's able to generate consensus, bring people to the table. So I think that that positions Guatemala very well in its quest for continuing to attract investment, continuing to position itself as a destination for nearshoring, for example. In Guatemala, sadly, was left out of the CHIPS Act here in the United States, but that doesn't mean that that there are no opportunities down the pipeline where Guatemala and the U.S. can, for example, work more closely together. I also know that President Arévalo he was there for Claudia Sheinbaum's inauguration and met with the Mexican private sector to talk about opportunities in the country. So none of that should change. And the president needs to find a good balance between being a president in Guatemala for the people who at the end of the day elected him, but also continuing to promote Guatemala as a destination for investment, as a country where things can happen. And I think that kind of proactive strategy will bring great results to Guatemala, and could be really like the highlight of his, segunda cosecha next year, perhaps. Um, that's Those are my thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Maria Fernanda and Christa. I think we have delved into a really productive and interesting conversation about the first year of President Arévalo in Guatemala, but also in preparation in the next US administration, and how Guatemala can position itself as a key and crucial partner for the United States, and how in this mechanism, how we can build relationship and partnerships with different sectors internationally, and also with Guatemalan and international private sector, and how Guatemala could become this crucial partner for the United States, especially with the diplomatic relationships that Guatemala has with Taiwan. It has been a pleasure to be with you in this X space. And remember that you can subscribe to the Atlantic Council newsletter in the atlanticcouncil.org website in the Latin America Center. And thank you all for being here and joining us.